A multi-million-dollar deal hangs in the balance. A table of powerful executives holds its breath, their careers teetering on a knife's edge. And at the head of the table sits the Japanese investor, who could make or break their company, a woman of immense wealth and influence who has refused to speak a single word of English. For 2 excruciating hours they've stumbled, trying to communicate through a useless translator, growing more desperate by the minute. They assume she's playing a power game, that her silence is a test of their resolve. They thought they understood money and power. They were wrong. They were about to learn that the biggest deals, the ones that change lives, are never about money at all. And the key was standing right beside them, clearing their plates. The air in Aurelia's private dining room was thick enough to be carved with the sterling silver knives resting on the table. It was a suffocating blend of expensive perfume, seared scallops, and raw, uncut desperation. Owen Finch felt the pressure, as a physical weight on his shoulders, a bespoke anvil tailored to his Zegna suit. Across the vast expanse of polished mahogany sat Ms. Kenna Saito, the enigmatic head of Saito Innovations, a titan of the Japanese tech industry. She was the whale, and his company Syntech Dynamics was the tiny, hopeful fishing boat with a very large harpoon. For 5 years, Owen had climbed the ladder at Syntech, sacrificing weekends, birthdays, and the ghost of a social life for this exact moment. This deal, a strategic partnership with Saito Innovations, wasn't just a career maker, it was a company saver. Syntech was bleeding, and Ms. Saito was the only surgeon who could stop it. She was smaller than he'd imagined, a delicate woman in her late 60s, her perfectly coiffed silver hair a stark contrast to her severe black Issey Miyake suit. She hadn't smiled once. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, missed nothing. They swept over the anxious faces of Owen's team, his boss, the perpetually grim CEO Walter Jennings, and 2 VPs who looked like they were about to be sick. But mostly, her gaze was impenetrable, a curtain of polite indifference. The catastrophic deal-sinking problem, was communication. They had been assured Ms. Saito had a working knowledge of English. This had turned out to be a spectacular overstatement. She spoke only Japanese, her voice a low, melodic murmur that was as beautiful as it was utterly incomprehensible. Their only bridge over this linguistic chasm was Mr. Peterson, a man from a high-end translation service who had been sold to them as the best in the business. Mr. Peterson was, to put it mildly, a disaster. He was a portly man with sweat beading on his upper lip, and his Japanese seemed to consist of a handful of phrases delivered with the confidence of a man reading a faulty instruction tool. Mr. Jennings. Peterson began clearing his throat for the 10th time. Wishes to express his profound, Yorokobi, his happiness, at this opportunity for togetherness. Ms. Saito listened, her expression unchanging. She replied with a short, elegant sentence. Peterson blinked. He licked his lips. Ah, yes. She says the room is very nice. The lighting is adequate. Walter Jennings's jaw tightened. Adequate. I paid this restaurant a fortune to redo the lighting for this dinner. Ask her about the Q4 projections for the joint venture, for God's sake, Peterson. Right. Projections, Peterson muttered, fumbling with his notes. He launched into a halting, clumsy string of Japanese words. It sounded less like a business query and more like he was trying to order a taxi to a library. Ms. Saito's response was longer this time. She spoke with a quiet intensity, her hands resting calmly on the table. It sounded important. Peterson listened, his face a mask of panic. He nodded slowly, as if absorbing profound wisdom. Finally, he turned back to the table. Ms. Saito is very interested in the the fish. She asks if it is a local fish. Owen felt a hot spike of fury. He could see the deal, his promotion, his future, all dissolving into a puddle of misunderstood seafood inquiries. Jennings looked like he was about to have an aneurysm. Throughout this slow-motion train wreck, a young woman moved with quiet grace at the edge of the room. Her name was Maya, just another one of the restaurant's waitstaff, tasked with keeping water glasses full and bread baskets replenished. She was unobtrusive, a ghost in a crisp black uniform. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple, severe ponytail, and her face, when you bothered to notice, it was one of composed neutrality. But she wasn't just going through the motions. Her eyes kept flitting towards the head of the table. She wasn't watching the powerful executives. She was listening intently to the Japanese woman they couldn't understand. As she refilled Ms. Saito's water glass, her movements were fluid and silent. Ms. Saito's eyes briefly met hers. It was a fleeting, inconsequential moment, the powerful client acknowledging the server. But for a split second, a flicker of something unreadable passed through Ms. Saito's gaze before the curtain of indifference fell again. Maya moved back to her station by the wall, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. But inside her heart was hammering. The Japanese Saito was speaking wasn't the standard formal dialect of Tokyo business. It was softer, tinged with the unmistakable accent of the Gifu prefecture, a mountainous rural region in the center of Japan. It was the accent of her mother. It was the accent of her childhood, a sound she hadn't heard in over a decade. The dinner continued its downward spiral. Jennings tried to use a presentation on his tablet, pointing at graphs and speaking slowly and loudly, as if Ms. Saito were a child. Ms. Saito simply watched him, her silence more powerful than any objection. Finally, after a particularly disastrous attempt by Peterson to translate a complex question about intellectual property rights into a garbled query about honorable idea boxes, Ms. Saito spoke a single sharp phrase. Peterson went pale. She requires a moment. He stood up, bowed clumsily, and practically fled the room. Jennings threw his napkin on the table. That's it. This is a waste of time. He's gone to hide in the bathroom. Owen, this was your play. Fix it. Owen's mind raced. What could he do? Call another service. It would take an hour. The moment would be lost. The deal would be dead. His eyes scanned the room in sheer desperation. They landed on the waitress Maya, standing silently by the wall. She was just a part of the scenery, a background player, but then he remembered a moment from earlier in the evening. As the kitchen doors swung open, he'd heard one of the chefs yell something at her in Spanish. She'd replied fluently, without missing a beat, before switching back to perfect English for another server. She was a linguist. It was a long shot, a shot in the dark from a mile away, but it was the only shot he had. He pushed his chair back and walked over to her, his movements stiff with anxiety. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "What's your name?" "Maya, sir." "Maya, I have a strange question for you. Do you happen to speak any other languages?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second. "A few, sir." Any Japanese?" The question felt absurd even as he asked it. Maya looked from Owen's desperate face to the silent, formidable woman at the head of the table. She thought of her mother, of the lullabies and stories whispered in that soft regional dialect. She thought of the tuition she was struggling to pay for her night classes in architecture, the dream that felt further away every day. This was a private dinner for powerful people. Getting involved was a risk. It was unprofessional. It could get her fired. But then she heard her mother's voice in her memory. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice that something else is more important. She met Owen's gaze. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. I do. The silence that followed Maya's one-word answer was more profound than the one that had dominated the dinner. Owen stared at her, a cocktail of disbelief and dawning hope swirling in his gut. Walter Jennings, who had overheard the exchange, slowly turned his head, his hawk-like eyes narrowing. You speak Japanese. Jennings's voice was a low growl laced with skepticism. He looked her up and down, taking in the simple black uniform, the apron, the subtle signs of a long shift on her feet. She was a waitress. In his world, people stayed in their designated boxes. Yes, sir, Maya replied, her chin held high. She refused to be intimidated. Owen stepped in his mind, racing. How well are you fluent? I was raised speaking it, she said simply, offering no further explanation. The truth was more complex, a childhood split between a small town in Gifu with her mother and an American international school in Tokyo, followed by a move to the States after her mother's death. But they didn't need her life story. They needed a bridge. Jennings grunted a sound of grudging consideration. Get Peterson back in here, he ordered one of the VPs. The VP returned a minute later, looking flustered. He's gone. I checked the restroom, the lobby. His coat is gone from the cloakroom. I think he ran. Jennings's face turned a shade of purple that clashed violently with his expensive tie. He rounded on Owen. Your $10,000 translator just bolted. The deal is dead. No. Owen said, a new, desperate energy surging through him. He turned back to Maya. I'll pay you $1,000 right now. Cash. Just for the rest of the dinner. Just translate for us. Maya's eyes widened slightly. $1,000 was more than a week's pay. It was a month's worth of textbooks. It was a genuine lifeline. But it was the principle, the sheer audacity of the situation that made her pause. They saw her as a tool, a sudden convenient solution to their mess. Jennings scoffed. 1,000! Give her 5, I don't care. Just get this done. He looked at Maya as if she were a piece of equipment he was purchasing. Can you handle this or not? This was her moment of decision. She could shrink back to the safety of the wall refill water glasses and let their multi-million-dollar world crumble on its own. Or she could step into the fire. She looked past the two desperate men to Ms. Kenasaito, who was watching the entire exchange with an unnerving stillness. There was no surprise on the older woman's face, only a quiet, patient observation, as if she were waiting for a foregone conclusion. I can handle it, Maya said, her voice firm. But not for $5,000. Owen and Jennings exchanged a look of disbelief. My fee? Maya continued, the words tasting strange and powerful on her tongue. Is 1% of any initial investment committed to as a result of this dinner, contingent on the deal closing, of course. Owen's jaw dropped. Walter Jennings actually took a step back. 1% on a deal potentially worth $50 million. They were talking about $500,000. For a waitress. You have got to be kidding me, Jennings hissed. That's ludicrous. Is it? Maya countered her gaze, unwavering. You hired the best in the business, and he fled. Your deal is currently worth 0. I am the only person in this building who can make it worth more than that. You aren't paying for a translator. You're paying for a chance. That's my price. She was terrified. Her heart was a hummingbird trapped in her ribs, but she held their gaze. She had spent years being invisible, overlooked. For the first time, she held all the cards, and she knew it. Owen looked at Jennings, whose face was a thundercloud. He could see the calculations running behind the man's eyes, the risk, the insult, the sheer gall of her proposal versus the catastrophic alternative of complete failure. Years of work, the fate of the company, the humiliation of returning to the board, empty-handed. "Fine." Jennings spat out the word, costing him dearly. "You have a deal. Now get over here and prove you're worth a damn cent of it." With a deep, steadying breath, Maya untied her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on her service station. It felt like shedding a skin. She walked towards the mahogany table, not as a server, but as a participant. She pulled up an empty chair, one meant for a junior executive who'd been cut from the guest list at the last minute, and sat down not next to Owen or Jennings, but directly to the side of Ms. Saito. She turned to the Japanese woman and bowed her head slightly, a gesture of respect her mother had insisted upon. Then she spoke. Her Japanese was flawless, not the stilted textbook version Peterson had mangled, but the soft, respectful and nuanced language of someone who had lived it. The Gifu accent was there a subtle, warm undercurrent. "Saito-sama yoi no o jikan o jama shite." "Moshiwake gozaimasen," she began. "Ms. Saito, I apologize for interrupting your evening. Watashi wa Maya to moshimasu. Moshi yoroshikereba tsuyaku o tsutome sasete itadakimasu. My name is Maya. If it is acceptable to you, I will serve as your interpreter." For the first time all evening, a genuine emotion crossed Miss Saito's face. It was a flicker of profound surprise, followed by a deep, searching curiosity. The mask of indifference was gone, replaced by an intensity that was almost startling. She studied Maya's face, her eyes seeming to look right through her. She replied, her voice softer than before. It was a simple question. Maya turned to the anxious American executives. "Ms. Saito asks where I learned to speak her language with the voice of the mountains." Owen stared, dumbfounded. "The voice of the mountains? What the hell does that mean?" "It means," Maya said, her gaze steady, "that she knows I'm not from Tokyo." She turned back to Ms. Saito, the hushed, melodic cadence of Japanese once again filling the room. The real dinner, it seemed, was only just beginning. The shift in the room's atmosphere was immediate and palpable. It was as if a pressure valve had been released. The clumsy grating noise of Peterson's failed translations was replaced by a fluid, respectful exchange. Maya became a conduit, a seamless link between two worlds that had been shouting at each other across an impassable gulf. Owen and Jennings watched, mesmerized and completely dependent. They were no longer in control. The power dynamic had been inverted, and the fulcrum was now a young woman they had barely noticed 20 minutes ago. "Let's get back on track," Jennings grumbled, trying to reclaim authority. "Owen, the Q4 projections. Ask her." Owen cleared his throat. "Maya, please convey to Ms. Saito that our projections for the fourth quarter show a potential market penetration of 15%, with a conservative profit margin of 12%. Maya listened, then turned to Ms. Saito, but she didn't just repeat the words. She reframed them, choosing her Japanese vocabulary with the precision of a poet. She didn't use the sterile, aggressive language of corporate conquest. Instead of market penetration, she used a phrase that evoked the idea of being welcomed into a new community. Instead of profit margin, she spoke of a fruitful harvest for all who tended the soil. It was a small change, but it was everything. Ms. Saito listened, a thoughtful expression on her face. She responded with a question, her tone measured. Maya translated. "Ms. Saito acknowledges the numbers. She says that numbers on a page are like seeds in a bag. Their potential is unknown until you understand the quality of the soil and the dedication of the farmer. She wants to know not what you project, but what core principles guide your company's cultivation." Jennings blinked. "Core principles? Tell her. Tell her our principle is shareholder value, maximizing returns." He said it like a mantra, the central dogma of his faith. Maya hesitated for a heartbeat. Translating that literally would be like throwing ice water on this fragile, budding rapport. She took a risk. Then she turned back to the Americans. I've conveyed that your primary goal is the success of all stakeholders, and that you approach this duty with the utmost integrity. Jennings gave her a sharp look, sensing she had edited him, but he couldn't object. The result was what mattered. Ms. Saito nodded slowly, a sign of cautious approval. The dinner proceeded like this for the next hour. Owen would present a technical aspect of the deal, supply chain logistics intellectual property, safeguards marketing strategy, and Maya would translate it not just into Japanese words, but into a cultural context Miss Saito would understand and respect. She was building a bridge, not of language, but of philosophy. Owen began to see the deal not as a series of figures on a spreadsheet, but as a story, a shared endeavor. He found himself explaining the why behind their strategies, the human element, something he hadn't focused on in months. He was in awe of Maya. She was a natural moving between the two languages, with an effortless grace. But he also noticed something else. The conversation wasn't entirely one-sided. Ms. Saito seemed to be guiding it, asking questions that were slightly off-topic. After a detailed discussion about distribution networks, Ms. Saito spoke, her voice softer. Maya translated a slight frown on her face. Mrs. Saito thanks you for the information. She asks a personal question. She asks what you believe is the most important quality to pass on to the next generation. Owen was thrown. The next generation? What does that have to do with anything? Just answer the question, Owen. Jennings muttered clearly, as confused as he was. Owen thought for a moment. Ambition. A strong work ethic. The drive to succeed. Maya relayed his answer. Ms. Saito listened, her expression unreadable. She replied with a single poignant sentence. She says, Maya's voice was quiet, that ambition is a hungry ghost. It consumes everything and is never satisfied. She believes resilience is more important. The strength to endure, to bend without breaking, and to find beauty in imperfection. The words hung in the air. This wasn't a business negotiation anymore. It was a lesson in philosophy. Owen felt a prickle of unease, a sense that he was being judged on a level he didn't even know existed. As the main courses were cleared away, Ms. Saito spoke again, this time, looking directly at Maya. The question was for her. Maya answered in Japanese, a short, simple response. What did she ask? Owen demanded, feeling like an outsider at his own dinner. She asked my family name. Maya said, her eyes still on Ms. Saito. I told her it's Tanaka. The name meant nothing to Owen or Jennings. But when Ms. Saito heard it, her composure, so carefully maintained all night, finally cracked. Her back straightened. Her hands, which had been resting calmly in her lap, clenched into tight fists on the table. The air grew tense again, but for an entirely different reason. The polite curiosity in her eyes was replaced by a blazing, laser-like focus. She leaned forward almost imperceptibly. She said another word. A name. Yumi. The question was a whisper, but it landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. Maya's blood ran cold. She felt the color drain from her face. It was a name she hadn't heard spoken by a stranger in 15 years, the name of her mother. The name hung in the air, a fragile, impossible thread connecting two disparate worlds. Yumi. For Owen Finch it was just a sound, a foreign word he didn't understand. He saw the sudden pallor on Maya's face, the shocking intensity that had seized Ms. Saito, and his mind scrambled for a business-related explanation. Was this a code word? A test, some prearranged signal he wasn't privy to? What's going on? Jennings demanded, his voice a harsh whisper. What did she say? Maya couldn't speak. Her throat had closed up. The elegant private dining room seemed to melt away, replaced by flashes of memory, her mother's hands dusted with flour, kneading dough in their small kitchen. The scent of cherry blossoms from the tree outside their window. The sound of her mother humming a soft, sad lullaby as she worked on her pottery. Yumi Tanaka, a ghost who had been with her every day of her life, suddenly given voice by a stranger. Ms. Saito saw the recognition, the shock, the dawning grief in Maya's eyes. She spoke again, her voice no longer the measured tone of a CEO, but thick with an emotion that transcended language. The words tumbled out urgent and pleading. Maya struggled to keep up her mind reeling. She translated automatically her own voice, sounding distant and strange to her ears. She is asking if my mother was Yumi Tanaka, from the village of Magome in the Kiso Valley. The specificity of the location was a physical shock, a confirmation that this was not a coincidence. Magome was not a place you named by accident. Yes, Maya whispered the word barely audible. She was. A strangled sound escaped Ms. Saito's lips. She reached a hand across the table, not towards the executives, but towards Maya. Her fingers trembled. She asks, Maya's voice cracked, if my mother ever spoke of a friend from her youth, a girl named Kenna, a girl who was like a sister to her, a girl who left the village to seek her fortune in Tokyo. Kenna, Ms. Kenna Saito. The pieces clicked into place with dizzying speed. Owen felt a wave of vertigo, as if the floor had dropped out from under him. This wasn't about a deal. It had never been about the deal. They had spent weeks preparing financial models, market analyses, and synergy reports for a meeting that was in reality a deeply personal quest. They were not business partners. They were props in a drama that had begun decades ago in a small mountain village on the other side of the world. My God, Owen breathed. Jennings was speechless, his face a mask of utter confusion. He looked from Ms. Saito's raw, emotional face to Maya's stunned expression, the gears of his ruthlessly pragmatic mind grinding to a halt, unable to process this new human data. Ms. Saito continued to speak the story pouring out of her, now translated by a tearful Maya. She spoke of a childhood friendship, forged in post-war Japan, two girls from humble families with big dreams. Yumi, the artist, whose talent with clay was like magic, and Kenna, the pragmatist, who dreamed of building things, of changing the world through business and technology. They had made a promise under the old cherry tree in the village square. Yumi would create beauty, and Kenna would build a world that had a place for it. She says my mother was a potter. Maya translated her voice, choked with emotion. That her work was transcendent. She specialized in kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold lacquer. Maya's hand instinctively went to the small, delicate pendant she wore around her neck, a shard of blue and white ceramic laced with a thin vein of gold. A gift from her mother. Ms. Saito's eyes locked onto the pendant. Her breath hitched. She spoke a single sharp sentence. Maya looked down at the familiar object, as if seeing it for the first time. She recognizes this piece. It was part of a set of tea bowls, a wedding gift my mother made for her before she left for Tokyo. The set was broken during an earthquake years ago. My mother found the pieces and repaired one shard, sending it to her as a symbol that even when things are broken, they can be made whole and more beautiful than before. This was the core principle Ms. Saito had asked about earlier. Resilience, finding beauty in imperfection. It wasn't a random philosophical question, it was a message. She had been searching for Yumi, sending out a signal that only someone who knew her would understand. Owen finally understood the silence, the refusal to speak English. It wasn't arrogance, it was a filter. She needed to hear the language of her home, of her past. She needed to hear the Gifu dialect. She had structured this entire high-stakes international business trip, this multi-million-dollar charade, as an elaborate, desperate attempt to find a ghost. And she had been talking to that ghost's daughter all along. "Where is she?" Ms. Saito asked, her voice raw with a lifetime of hope and fear. "Where is Yumi I have searched for so long? After my business succeeded, I sent people. The old house was empty. The neighbors didn't know where she went. They said she married an American and left Japan. I couldn't find her. Please, tell me, where is your mother?" The room was utterly still. All the pretense of business, of power and negotiation had been stripped away, leaving only this raw, painfully human question. Owen and Jennings were forgotten, their deal a meaningless footnote. Maya looked at the powerful, wealthy woman, the titan of industry, and saw only Kenna, her mother's lost friend. She saw the years of searching, the hope against hope that had driven her here, and she knew her next words would break her heart. She took a deep breath, the gold-laced ceramic cool against her skin. "I'm so sorry," Maya said the English words, feeling heavy and inadequate. She switched back to the soft Japanese of her childhood, the language of lullabies and loss. My mother passed away 15 years ago. It was cancer. We were living in America then. She's buried in a small cemetery in California, overlooking the ocean. The dam of Ms. Saito's composure, held in place for 68 years, finally broke. A single perfect tear traced a path down her cheek, a silent testament to a reunion that would never happen, and a friendship that time had never managed to erase. The single tear was followed by another, and then another. Ms. Kenna Saito, the unshakable matriarch of a global tech empire, began to weep. It was not a loud, theatrical grief, but a silent, profound sorrow that seemed to emanate from the very core of her being. She covered her face with her hands, her small frame shaking with the weight of a search that had ended in the most heartbreaking way imaginable. The private dining room at Aurelia, a space designed for ruthless negotiations and corporate celebrations, became a sanctuary of grief. Owen Finch and Walter Jennings sat frozen in their seats, transformed from powerful executives into awkward, helpless spectators. Their world of profit margins and market shares had no protocol for this. There was no spreadsheet that could calculate the value of a lost friendship, no strategy memo that could mitigate the finality of death. Maya, however, knew exactly what to do. She rose from her chair, moved to Ms. Saito's side, and did what her mother would have done. She placed a gentle, steadying hand on the older woman's shoulder. She didn't offer empty platitudes or apologies. She simply stood there, a quiet, living link to the friend Ms. Saito had lost. She began to speak to her in low, soothing Japanese, her voice the oral equivalent of a comforting embrace. Owen couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Maya was telling stories. She was sharing memories of her mother, small, intimate details that painted a portrait of the woman Yumi had become. She spoke of her mother's love for gardening, how she could coax roses to bloom in the most stubborn soil. She described the way her mother would hum old Japanese folk songs, while she cooked the same songs Kenna would have remembered from their childhood. She talked about her mother's unwavering belief in education, how she had worked 2 jobs to ensure Maya would have the opportunities she never did. Through Maya's words, Yumi Tanaka came alive in the room. She was no longer just a name, a ghost from the past, but a fully formed person, a mother, an artist, an immigrant who had carried the soul of her mountain village with her across the ocean. Ms. Saito slowly lowered her hands. Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes were clear. She looked at Maya, truly looked at her, and in the young woman's features, the curve of her eyes, the determined set of her jaw, she saw the ghost of her friend. "She had your strength," Miss Saito said in Japanese, her voice thick but steady. "Yumi was the strongest person I ever knew. She looked delicate like one of her porcelain bowls, but she was unbreakable." She reached out and gently touched the kintsugi pendant at Maya's neck. "She sent me this after I lost my husband. My company was failing. I was broken. This shard reminded me of our promise. It reminded me of her strength. It gave me the resilience to rebuild." It was a staggering revelation. The symbol of Yumi's artistry had not just been a memento. It had been the catalyst for Saito innovations, recovery, and subsequent meteoric rise. The very foundation of the empire that had brought them all to this table tonight was built on a piece of broken pottery and the memory of a childhood promise. Owen felt a profound sense of shame. He had viewed this dinner as a transaction, Ms. Saito as a target, and Maya as a tool. He had been so focused on the what, the investment, the numbers, the contracts, that he had completely missed the why. He had seen a wealthy investor, not a woman carrying a lifetime of love and loss. He had seen a waitress, not the daughter of the woman who had inspired it all. His entire worldview, built on the cold logic of business, was shattering around him. Even Walter Jennings, a man seemingly carved from granite, was visibly moved. The cynical calculating mask had fallen away, revealing a man utterly out of his depth. He looked at Maya with a new grudging respect. She hadn't just translated words. She had translated souls. The rest of the expensive meal sat untouched, growing cold on the fine china. The purpose of the dinner had been fulfilled, but it had nothing to do with Syntech dynamics. Ms. Saito and Maya continued to talk their conversation, shifting from the past to the present. Ms. Saito asked about Maya's life, her studies in architecture, her dreams. She learned about Maya's struggle working long hours at the restaurant to pay for night school, her quiet determination to build a life her mother would be proud of. As she listened, a new expression began to form on Ms. Saito's face, replacing the grief. It was resolve. The pragmatist, the builder she had always been, was re-emerging, but with a new, deeply personal purpose. Finally, she turned her attention back to the two American men who had been sitting in stunned silence for the better part of an hour. She looked at Owen, then at Jennings. She spoke in clear, authoritative Japanese. Maya took a breath and turned to face her temporary employers. The power dynamic had shifted once more. She was no longer just the translator or the key to a lost past. She was the architect of the future. "Ms. Saito," Maya began, her voice steady and clear, "would like to discuss the terms of her investment." Jennings sat up, his corporate instincts kicking in automatically, a drowning man spotting a raft. "Yes, of course." However, Maya continued, "the original proposal is no longer on the table. The terms have changed." The silence that followed Maya's announcement was charged with a different kind of tension. The emotional storm had passed, leaving in its wake a landscape that was clear, altered, and ready for new construction. Jennings leaned forward, his eyes narrowed, ready to salvage whatever he could from the wreckage of their initial plan. "Changed how?" he asked, his voice tight. Ms. Saito spoke, her tone calm, but infused with an iron will that had built an empire. Maya translated her words precise and deliberate. Ms. Saito is no longer interested in a passive investment in Syntech Dynamics, Maya stated. She finds your company's technology promising, but its soul lacking. She is proposing a different kind of partnership. Owen braced himself. He expected a list of harsh demands, a corporate restructuring, perhaps a complete takeover. She is prepared to invest $100 million, Maya said. Jennings's eyes widened. That was double their initial ask. This was a stunning victory, snatched from the jaws of a bizarre, emotional defeat. He opened his mouth to accept, but Maya held up a hand. This investment is contingent on the creation of a new joint venture subsidiary. This new entity will not focus on your current corporate or military contracts. Its mandate will be to develop and apply your logistical and AI technologies for humanitarian purposes, disaster relief, refugee camp management, and sustainable infrastructure development in underserved regions. Owen stared at her dumbfounded. This wasn't just a change in terms. It was a complete reimagining of their company's purpose. Furthermore, Maya continued, her gaze unwavering. This new venture will be named the Yumi Foundation for Resilient Futures. Its headquarters will not be in your corporate tower. You will build a new architecturally significant campus, a building that embodies the principles of Kintsugi, finding strength and beauty in what was once broken. It will be a place of innovation, but also of art and contemplation. Ms. Saito added another sentence, her eyes fixed on Maya. And finally, Maya said, her voice catching slightly. The design and oversight of this new campus will be led by the Foundation's new executive director of planning and development. She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. That position is being offered to me. If the room had been silent before it was now a vacuum. Jennings looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. He stared at Maya, this waitress, this girl who, hours ago, he wouldn't have given a second glance, and who was now being handed the reins of $100 million foundation. That's preposterous, Jennings stammered. She has no experience. She's a student, Ms. Saito replied instantly, her voice sharp. Ms. Saito says that I have more experience in what truly matters than anyone at this table. Maya translated a flush of pride, coloring her cheeks. She says I understand resilience, integrity, and the legacy of Yumi Tanaka. She says business acumen can be taught. A soul cannot. She is not investing in your technology, Mr. Jennings. She is investing in a memory, and she is entrusting that memory to me. The finality in her tone was absolute. This was not a negotiation. It was a decree. Take the deal, Walter, Owen said quietly, finding his voice at last. Jennings spun around to face him. Are you insane? We put a waitress in charge of $100 million project. Yes, Owen replied, a newfound clarity in his eyes. We do, because this isn't about us anymore. It was never about us. We stumbled into something bigger. For weeks we've been trying to figure out how to impress her what she wanted to see in our numbers. But we were looking at the wrong ledger. This is what she wants. This is the real deal. He looked at Maya, not as a server or a translator, but as a colleague, an equal. She's right, Walter. This company could use a soul. The battle in Jennings's mind was visible on his face. He was a shark being asked to become a dolphin. His entire career had been built on a ruthless focus on the bottom line. But $100 million was $100 million, and the story was undeniably powerful. A humanitarian foundation born from a lost friendship, led by the artist's daughter. The press would love it. The board, once they understood the numbers, would have to agree. It was madness, but it was brilliant madness. He slumped back in his chair, defeated and, in a strange way, liberated. "All right," he sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "All right." "Ms." Saito nodded, a faint, sad smile gracing her lips for the first time. The transaction was complete. It wasn't the deal Owen or Jennings had wanted, but it was a better one. It was a deal that wasn't about acquiring assets, but about creating a legacy. As the dinner finally concluded, Ms. Saito and Maya stood to leave together. Ms. Saito formally dismissed her own car, and driver insisting that Maya accompany her. As they walked towards the door, Ms. Saito paused and turned back to Owen. She spoke a few words in gentle Japanese. Maya smiled softly. "She says thank you, Mr. Finch, not for the dinner but for your desperation. She says sometimes we must be completely lost before we are willing to ask for directions from the one person who knows the way." Owen Finch watched them go, the elderly titan of industry, and the young architectural student who had been serving his water just hours before. They walked out of the restaurant not as an investor and a translator, but as two women bound by a shared past and a newly forged future, leaving two stunned executives behind to pick up the pieces of their shattered illusions and start building something new. 16 months later, the California sun, a soft, buttery gold, poured through the towering glass walls of the Yumi Foundation for Resilient Futures. The building itself felt alive, a breathing testament to its own philosophy. It was not a sterile corporate headquarters, but a dynamic space of wood, light, and stone designed to feel both innovative and ancient. Down the center of the main atrium, a dramatic lightning bolt fissure split a 40-foot wall of polished concrete, a deliberate, shocking imperfection. But within that crack, a brilliant, intricate lattice of gold didn't just fill the void, it celebrated it, turning a scar into the building's radiant, beating heart. It was kintsugi, writ large, a daily reminder of the Foundation's soul. The air hummed with a quiet, focused energy. Engineers in jeans huddled with humanitarian logisticians in field vests, their tablets displaying satellite maps and supply chain algorithms. In a sun-drenched corner, a young artist in residence sketched the interplay of light and shadow on the golden fissure, her work considered as vital to the Foundation's mission as any algorithm. At the head of a large, reclaimed wood table in a glass-walled conference room, Maya Tanaka presided over the weekly operations meeting. The transformation was profound. Gone was the black Waitress uniform, replaced by a simple but impeccably tailored navy blue dress. Her dark hair, once bound in a tight, severe ponytail, now fell in soft waves around her shoulders. She was no longer invisible. She was the center of gravity in every room she entered. Yet her leadership was not one of command, but of quiet inquiry and deep listening. The monsoon season in the Delta is arriving 2 weeks earlier than projected. She said, her voice calm and clear as she gestured to a complex meteorological map on the screen. Our models show that the temporary shelters we have on site won't withstand a Category 3 water surge. What are our options? A dozen hands didn't shoot up. Instead, her team, a hand-picked group of the brightest minds from the non-profit world, and the tech sector paused, considered, and then began to collaborate. We could airlift in the new amphibious modules, offered a young engineer named Ben, but the lead time from the manufacturer is 10 days. It's too close. What about retrofitting? Asked a veteran aid worker, a woman named Maria, who had spent 20 years in the field. The existing shelters are structurally sound. It's the anchoring and the waterproofing that are the weak points. Maya listened intently, her gaze moving from face to face. "I like that, Maria. It's a kintsugi approach. We don't discard what's broken, we strengthen it. Ben, could your team design a retrofitting kit? Something lightweight we can deploy quickly." Before Ben could answer, the door slid open, and Owen Finch walked in, carrying a tablet of his own. The frantic, desperate energy he once radiated was gone, replaced by a calm confidence. The haunted look in his eyes had been supplanted by a clear sense of purpose. He hadn't received the promotion he'd once coveted at Syntec Dynamics. Instead, he had fought for a newly created position, Chief Technical Liaison to the Yumi Foundation. It was a role that connected the corporate might of Syntec to the Foundation's humanitarian soul, and it had redefined his life. "Sorry I'm late," he said, taking a seat. "I was on a call with the Syntec board. They've officially approved the R&D budget for your resilient anchoring system." Walter Jennings would have had a heart attack, he added with a wry smile. A ripple of laughter went through the room. The story of that night at Aurelia was legendary within the Foundation's walls. "Perfect timing, Owen." Maya smiled warmly. "We need it. We need a prototype, and we need it yesterday." "Already on it," Owen replied, his fingers flying across his tablet. He projected a 3D schematic onto the main screen. "This is what my team mocked up last week when we saw the initial weather warnings. It's a carbon fiber bracing system with self-drilling anchors. It's light-strong and can be installed by 2 people in under an hour. We can have 100 kits fabricated and ready to ship in 72 hours. Maya looked at the design, then at Owen, a deep sense of gratitude in her eyes. "You already saw the problem coming. This place taught me to look at the cracks before they become chasms," he said quietly, his meaning extending far beyond engineering. "The board is thrilled, by the way. Our stock price is up 20% since the Foundation launched. Apparently having a soul is good for business." After the meeting, as the team dispersed with a renewed sense of urgency, Owen and Maya walked together into the main atrium. "I still can't believe this is real sometimes," Owen confessed, gazing up at the golden wall. "Do you remember how terrified I was that night I thought my career was over?" "You thought the deal was the most important thing in the room," Maya corrected gently. "We both learned something to that night." "I learned that I was a fool," he said with a self-deprecating laugh, "and that 1% of the right deal is worth more than 100% of the wrong one." He was referring to her audacious fee, which at her insistence had become the seed money for the Foundation's art residency program. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a small, graceful woman with a serene smile. Kenna Saito, who now spent half the year in California, radiated a warmth that seemed to emanate from her very core. She carried a single perfect white camellia in her hand. "Maya-chan, Owen-san." She greeted them, bowing her head slightly. "I see you are busy saving the world." "Just one small piece of it at a time, Kenna-san." Maya replied, her tone filled with affection. "The most important piece is the one right in front of you," Kenna said wisely. She looked at the bustling atrium, the passionate people working towards a common good. "This is more than I ever dreamed of building. Saito Innovations created products. This place creates futures." She turned to Maya, her eyes soft. "Will you walk with me?" They excused themselves from Owen and walked out into the memorial garden Maya had designed. It was a masterpiece of tranquility, blending Japanese principles of wabi-sabi, the acceptance of transience and imperfection, with the native California landscape. A meandering stream flowed over smooth stones, and a grove of cherry trees stood as a living tribute to a promise made in another country long ago. At the garden's heart was a simple, unadorned slab of black granite. Kenna gently placed the white camellia at its base. Yumi Tanaka. The cracks are where the light gets in, and the gold proves we can heal. They stood in silence for a long moment, the sounds of the bustling foundation, a distant hum. In Japan, the white camellia symbolizes a gentle passing, but also adoration and everlasting love, Kenna said softly. She loved them. Her small garden was full of them. I remember, Maya whispered, a faint memory of the flower's delicate scent surfacing in her mind. I used to be so angry at the world for taking her before I could find her. Kenna confessed, her gaze fixed on the engraved name. I spent decades building an empire, thinking that success would somehow fill that empty space. But all the success, all the money, it just made the silence louder. That night at the restaurant, when I finally accepted she was gone, the grief was immense. But then I looked at you, and I realized she had not left an empty space. She had left a foundation. She had left you. She turned to face Maya, her eyes glistening. This building, this mission, our work. It is not just a memorial, Maya-chan. It is a continuation. It is the conversation Yumi and I never got to finish. Her art was about mending what was broken. My skill was in building systems. Together through you, we are finally doing what we promised each other we would as girls. We are mending a small, broken piece of the world and making it more beautiful. Maya felt a tear trace a path down her own cheek, but it was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of profound, overwhelming gratitude. She looked from her mother's name on the stone to the shimmering golden wall, visible through the garden's trees. She thought of her past as a waitress living in the shadows, and her improbable present. It was all connected. Every difficult shift, every lonely night studying every memory of her mother, they weren't separate, broken pieces. They were the essential fragments of her life, and now they had been put back together with pure gold. The story of Maya, Kenna, and Owen isn't just about a business deal that took an unexpected turn. It's a powerful reminder that beneath the titles, the balance sheets, and the languages that divide us, we are all driven by deeply human needs for connection, for purpose, and for healing old wounds. It shows that the most valuable person in the room isn't always the one with the most power, but the one with the most understanding. True wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the legacies we build and the lives we touch. A single moment of courage from a waitress, a desperate gamble by an executive, and a lifetime of searching by an investor all collided to create something more meaningful than any of them could have ever achieved alone. If this story moved you and reminded you of the hidden connections that shape our world, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates stories of hope and transformation, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that uncover the extraordinary in the most ordinary of places. Thank you for listening.